Computer. Okay, so welcome everyone to the Centre for Global Education's contribution to the CADA One World Festival. My name is Stephen McCluskey. I'm the director of the Centre for Global Education. And today the question we're asking is whether in the context of accelerating poverty in the global north, whether development agencies, international development agencies, should focus more on poverty on their own doorstep, rather than focusing more specifically on poverty in the global south. And joining me in this conversation, I have two Murphys who aren't related and work for different organizations. So we have Caroline Murphy, who's a colleague of mine in the Centre for Global Education and is the manager of a schools program. And Michelle Murphy, who is a researcher and policy analyst with Social Justice Ireland. So if you don't mind me asking, Michelle, could you say in a few sentences what exactly it is that the organization does?
Absolutely, Stephen, and thanks very much for inviting me to join. So Social Justice Ireland, we're an independent social justice think tank. Socialjustice.ie is the website. I suppose all of our work is geared towards developing a just and sustainable society where human development is promoted, human rights are respected, and I suppose the needs of those are members of our society, whether local or global, who are most vulnerable, are advocated and respected in sort of the policy making process. And the purpose of our work, our policy work and our research work is to build a better society and to ensure that there's nobody left behind, be that in our work on housing, on overseas development assistance, on income distribution or taxation. As a whole, all of our work is geared towards ensuring we build a better society for everybody who lives here.
So is the focus of your work on Ireland specifically, or is it focusing on Ireland but in an international context?
Focusing on Ireland in an international context. So we look at national policy, but then we look at how our policy situates within the European Union and the European semester framework and the impact that being a member of the EU has on national policy making and our budgetary policy. And then we have a specific focus also on developing countries, the global south, and on overseas development assistance, and the value of that work and the need to contribute to that work to meet our own targets around ODA and to ensure that, in the midst, now we're emerging from a pandemic, that we don't forget those countries who are really struggling in other parts of the world, and the value of the work in terms of ODA and development work, value that is for the poorest in our world, and that we support both people who are struggling in Ireland, but also people who are struggling globally, and how we integrate the two.
Perfect. So you've got a very strong local global dimension to your work. And Caroline, as a development educator working in the Centre for Global Education, so do you, because DevEd is both local and global. In fact, all of the work you do is locally with educators in an Irish context, but in a wider international context as well. Isn't that right?
That's right, Stephen. It's really all about exploring that interdependence, the interdependence between this side of the world and countries in the global south. And our work has a strong focus on supporting teachers to bring issues of global justice into the classroom and bring it deeply across the curriculum and subject areas. So we work directly with teachers, training teachers, and then teachers implement the practice in the classroom.
Okay, but within that, you talk about poverty at a local level as well as internationally as well, don't you?
Yeah, everything's looked at through that lens of the system, if you think about the wider system. So no matter what the issue is it, if it's an issue of poverty, if it's an issue of climate, if an issue of gender justice, it's all looked at through the global system, and to look at it critically and what the underpinning causes are.
Okay, in terms of kicking off this conversation about whether international agencies need to focus more on poverty at home, I wanted to ask a general question about how the 2008 global financial crisis and more recently the pandemic that really kicked in last year, how both of those things have accelerated poverty in the global north. Would you mind kicking off with that one, Michelle? Maybe talking a wee bit about how poverty has accelerated in the south of Ireland, specifically where you're working.
Yes, I mean, absolutely, Stephen. The crash, I suppose, what at the aftermath of the financial crash, you saw a significant rise in the poverty rates and also the deprivation rates, the unemployment rates, and I suppose at a European level and a national level, it really kind of highlighted the stark contrast between those on the lowest incomes and those on higher incomes. And ultimately, it was those who were struggling pre-2008 and again pre-2020 who have been most impacted and who are at risk of being left further behind. And even if we look at the period after 2016, when we were recovering from the financial crisis, we had very high economic growth rates. And by 2019, we had almost full employment here in the Republic of Ireland. At the same time, deprivation rates were rising, and that would be very concerning, because what that tells us is that actually many people were still struggling. They were still struggling to maintain a decent standard of living. People on fixed income, so people on social welfare rates, people on a disability payment or pension, for example, had their poverty rates weren't falling as to where you would expect them to be with that type of economic growth. And I suppose that the persistent problem we've had, and you can see it reflected in the figures for in the north as well, is the issue of child poverty. We've never really managed to get to grips with that. It's kind of been consistently around the same level, particularly here in Ireland. It's been around 200,000 children persistently living in poverty and households experiencing poverty. And the same in the north. Just looking at the figures from last year, again, pre-housing costs of about 100,000 children living in relative poverty, but then in absolute poverty, which is very concerning, of 75,000 children. And I think after the pandemic, in a way, we won't see the impact for a next year or two due to the time lag in statistics. And also you have to wait for, I suppose, the furlough schemes, what was here in the Republic, the pandemic unemployment payment and the wage subsidy schemes. Once they wind down, then you'll begin to see the real impact in terms of poverty and deprivation. But I think it's going to have a very substantial impact, particularly on those people who were in challenging situations pre-COVID.
Absolutely, and it's the same up here in the north, because the £20 uplift in universal credit was withdrawn yesterday by Boris Johnson and the Tory government. So apparently that's going to impact 44,000 households up here. So there's over 100,000 people on universal credit. So that's only going to increase levels of poverty in the north. You're absolutely right about the level of child poverty. A pre-pandemic study by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation in the north found that 370,000 people were living in poverty up here. I don't know if that's extreme levels of poverty, absolute poverty or not, but of that total, 110,000 were children, as you indicated, which is pretty much the same figures you just used. 220,000 working age adults and 40,000 pensioners. So, Caroline, we definitely have a very serious issue with poverty up here, and you would imagine that's only going to get worse on the basis of the withdrawal of the furlough scheme and that kind of safety net being taken away from people. And also what we're seeing is a serious level of deprivation in terms of education through the pandemic. I think you've directly experienced that as an educator, haven't you?
That's definitely right. There's a major crisis in the education sector, especially like about capacity of teachers, well-being, and so on. I mean, it's huge. And as you're saying, Michelle, we're actually living in it now, so it's really hard to know what the longer term impact would be. But Stephen, when I read the brief for this session about looking back at the time of the financial crisis, I kind of had a bit of reflection, and it cast my mind back to what I was doing at that time, back in 2008. And at that time, I was working for Children in Crossfire, and we were implementing a program with schools called Not My Problem. And it was a branch of another project we were doing, which was 8 Good Reasons, based then on the Millennium Development Goals. But it's interesting reflecting back, because at that time we went in and we did a lot of consultations with young people. They'd have been 12 or 13 then, so they'd be like in their mid-20s now. And the idea was to consult with them to see what their issues were, what their concerns were, and then we were going to work with them through drama-based methods and so on to empower and lead to actions. But when I looked back at the stuff, and I pulled out a few quotes from the young people themselves at that time, because I thought they were quite interesting to read and to look back on. And one quote was, "I am really afraid of the crash." The crash was the term then. "Everyone will lose their jobs." Another one was, "I just keep hearing about the cuts. Lots of people will be homeless. What if we can't get the stuff we want? People might starve even." So that was at the time then. We were collating that information just in 2008. But it was interesting. It's like the wisdom of young people, because of course we did see a huge loss of jobs. We saw austerity measures, pay freezes, loss of homes, and then of course that rise in food banks. So when you look at all that, the young people were projecting their fears, and of course the heightened inequalities that Michelle alluded to. But I think you could take those statements those young people made then and apply them to the crisis now. Mm-hmm. Those same statements would hold true. And then on top of that is the mental well-being crisis, and of course the whole education crisis. I mean, teachers are trying to engage young people through like a global pandemic, and it's not easy. But
and so
there was a lot of fear, and also there's a lot of fears in the young people and the teachers about the whole climate issue. Yeah.
I was going to say that many of the issues you've just described have worsened now under the pandemic, because many people were still in recovery mode post 2008 or hadn't recovered. Their incomes had been cut. And then we were thrust into this pandemic. Many people lost their jobs. Many people struggled to keep their homes and so on. So poverty has worsened again post pandemic. We're not even in a post pandemic situation yet. But Michelle, international development NGOs or development agencies might say, right, okay, we understand that poverty is getting worse here in Ireland, both north and south, but it's also gotten a lot worse in the global south as well, particularly countries that have had no vaccination whatsoever. Their economies are really struggling at the moment. Poverty is worsening. They might say that their priority needs to be on poverty in the global south. We don't have the capacity, particularly given cuts in aid. For example, we've seen a massive cut to the aid budget in Britain. We don't have the capacity to focus on poverty at home. And besides all of that, it's not really in our remit to do that. So I know they're strong arguments, but I just wondered what would you say in response to that, if that was the approach taken by international NGOs?
Well, I think the approach I would take is actually to ask them what they could bring to how they can improve the local focus and the focus we have on poverty, because I think those organizations are facing the same challenges now that they faced post 2008 in terms of when governments start fiscal retrenchment. And as you say, you've already seen it from the UK and potentially elsewhere. One of the easiest budgets to cut, because it doesn't affect your local population, is actually the ODA budget, because it doesn't have an impact in the budget on someone's social welfare payment, on the income tax they pay or don't pay. So it's one of the budgets that generally tends to be the first to cut. Now the Irish government is committed to maintain their target of 0.7% of national income, but I think the sector can, I suppose, get engaged with discussions and inform, I suppose, in terms of the best practice that they see in their work in developing countries, in terms of impacts on poverty, because at the end of the, poverty is hugely multifaceted. There's, it's down to services and education, but at the end of the day, it is always about income. No matter where you are, poverty at the end of the day is about income. And I think the sector will certainly face more challenges, because locally now you are going to see increases in deprivation. And I suppose what we've seen in the past 10 years is the commensurate increase in then almost a them and us. So, for example, we should be focusing on poverty at home. Why are we sending money abroad when we have all these problems here? Another area being why we should house our own people first. Why are we housing refugees or migrants? So in terms of countering that narrative, I actually think the development sector has a huge potential to contribute to the policy making here. And also they can learn from, I suppose, the policy making sector here in terms of, projects, etc., that they're going to be running themselves in developing countries. And what you alluded to there, Stephen, in terms of the economies of the global south and the impact that the pandemic has had on them, with lack of vaccines, the impact that the interruption on education is going to have on those countries. But also, what has been in the news in the past 2 days is the now soon to be signed off, I presume this afternoon, by the cabinet down here anyway, the OECD tax proposals and the new global tax reform. And I think development organizations certainly have a role to play in trying to influence tax policy nationally, because that policy has an impact on developing countries, and to make sure that the tax policies that we pursue don't put developing countries at a disadvantage, and it actually supports their economies. I think that's something that's incredibly important that the sector can really contribute to. And also, I suppose the other element here, we've heard a lot about it recently, the rise in utility costs and the impact of carbon taxes. And I suppose the impact of us greening our economy and shifting our economy so we meet our climate targets and those set out in the global goals. Development organizations at first hand see the impact of climate change in developing countries, and 90% of extreme weather events are impacting on those countries. But they can also educate local communities and look at the impact of potentially what that will be in local communities and that impact on poverty to inform policy here. So I don't think it's an either or situation. I certainly think they have a lot to contribute, and certainly probably could take some learnings from the national policy making process as well.
I'm guessing, Caroline, you'll agree with that whole idea of development agencies getting into education and raising awareness of the global connections between global warming and the global economy locally and globally, and making that contribution at a local level that perhaps isn't being made at the moment. So the same question to you, how do we persuade international NGOs that they do have a local role to play in terms of poverty here on their doorstep?
I think the very first thing I would like to say is a lot of development NGOs are already doing amazing work. And the work they are doing in the global south, that development work is like life-changing, fantastic, and radical to a sense. Like there is quite a bit of work going on overseas. It's really, really good. And mostly for development NGOs, the remit does sit in that international development overseas work, and a lot of it's tied to the aid budget and so on. So for development NGOs to begin to implement projects at that level, those development projects locally might be a bit complicated and they might not have the capacity for it. But what you're pointing at there, Stephen, I think there's a huge opportunity, because most NGOs now have a public engagement or a development education remit. And I see that as where the opportunity is to really raise awareness of the more local poverty issues and make the connection between the local and global. And I mean, the whole development sector in itself could maybe get stronger position in itself with activist groups in Ireland, more local community groups, to really tap into the issues locally and help them connected globally. But I think, to Michelle, I think you were referring to, I think that advocacy and campaigning element is missing. I think that's what's missing from the sector. And if somehow the development sector could collectively get a real strong campaign and advocacy element, I think that would go a long way to bridging the gap. But yeah, for development organisations to begin doing development work here locally might be a tall order to expect.
But they probably could re-engage with development education in a bigger way than they are at the moment, which is something they used to do. When I first came into the sector in the mid-90s, basically the sector was being sustained at that point by development NGOs, and then gradually over time they started to withdraw. And I think re-engaging with development education would also connect the bigger NGOs with their community base as well, I think, as well as a clear understanding of the main causes of poverty locally and globally. Michelle, what are the main connecting points, do you think, between poverty locally and poverty globally? And I know we're all interconnected through this global economy, and this global economy has run into serious problems of late, particularly since 2008. But it seems to me, certainly in our sector in development education, we hardly ever talk about the global economic model that underpins development, i.e. neoliberalism, and the problems that has encountered, particularly in 2008 when it had this massive collapse. Do you think, given the fact that we're all connected to this global or world trade and global economic system, that the international NGOs could bring more to the table in terms of debating what's going wrong locally in terms of poverty escalation and so on?
I think, Stephen, certainly they could. And it actually goes back to the point both yourself and Caroline made there in terms of the education element and making the links, the links in terms of income distribution, in resourcing, the links in terms of what sort of economic policies are we following globally and what is the impact of those policies. And I suppose what the crash really showed us is that that leads to an upward redistribution of resources, and there is no such thing as rising tide lifting all boats. That absolutely is a completely false narrative, and I think it's been proven to be false twice now. And what the crash really showed was the glaring inequalities were laid bare. We've never really managed to address them. So wages are still falling, which is concerning globally. The number of people who are considered working poor, so they're in employment, but they don't earn enough to lift themselves out of the poverty line, is rising, and it's rising across Europe, which is concerning. The number of young people who are either in precarious employment or not engaged in employment, education, or training at all, especially since the crash, they would be in their 30s now. That's a very significant and concerning number. And the global economic policy after the crash, we kind of just went back to business as usual. And because there was high levels of GDP growth, as fictitious as they were in the Irish context, because of the results of some multinationals, what looks like positive development on paper in reality isn't. I mean, young people have been priced out of the housing market down here. We have persistently high levels of poverty and inequality, educational disadvantage. I mean, we are making some progress, but not the type of progress we should be making. Our healthcare system, has faced significant challenges over the past decade. We still don't have, a decent broadband infrastructure or any sort of proper state-led childcare infrastructure. You might say, well, why are these issues important? Well, they're the same issues globally. And I suppose what the past 18 months, at the beginning did show us, and people stopped and thought, well, maybe there's a need for a new social contract, to rethink how we do things, to rethink our economic model, our social model. And we saw that, you can make real progress on your climate emissions when essentially things stopped for a number of months. But now we're back to where we were, and it looks like policy is almost back to where we were. So I certainly think there's a role there for, national agencies and global development agencies and organizations to come together, to look at the connection points in terms of educating our young people, but also to look at what can we change, how can we change it, does work, what doesn't work. How do you build capacity at a local level, be that in a developing country or be that in a community here, a disadvantaged community here? How do you influence policy? How do you show what is the best use of resources in terms of when you are in the policy making sphere at a national level, when it comes to budgets, when it comes to distributing those resources? How do you make your case? How do you make the case for those who are essentially voiceless? And how do we show, or how can they show, how national policy interacts with global policy? Because Caroline mentioned the Millennium Development Goals, and they were almost seen as goals that only applied to the global south, not to anyone else, even though it was, we all signed up to it. And I think with the Sustainable Development Goals, we've moved slightly beyond that, but at the same time, they still seem to apply mainly to developing countries. Whereas what development organizations have is the capacity to show how those global goals apply to us all, both locally and globally.
Caroline, you would probably agree with the idea that we haven't really engaged, as in the international development sector, with the concept of neoliberalism and how that has been aligned with development. So this idea that development equals growth still dominates, I think, even after the 2008 global financial crisis, and now even after the pandemic. Even though the global economic system has failed twice miserably, we still have this idea of the market will provide dominating the discourse. And I've just wondered, as an educator, how do you think we can penetrate that and persuade colleagues in the international development sector to start thinking critically about what we mean by development and what we mean by economic development?
Yeah, I think it's a perfect opportunity for ourselves as educators to really look at how we've been educating and how we've been implementing development education. And again, I'm being careful because I know there's a lot of brilliant work going on and there's a lot of really good work going on. But I do think that critical lens is missing. That lens that really, really unpacks the system. Because a lot of the time we go to the issues, which are very important, but the issues at times, they're mostly just symptoms of a failing system. So the actual system itself needs critiqued and needs critiqued soundly. And it's all about upskilling ourselves constantly as educators ourselves, which we don't get the time for. A lot of the times we do not get the time to reflect on how we're teaching and how we're engaging people in a process. So that critical analysis is so important. And Stephen, you mentioned neoliberalism. I mean, we need to begin to address that and begin to address it with teachers and so on.
Which brings me to my final question, which is about the main challenges to trying to implement a development strategy at home that engages critically with the causes of poverty at a local level as well as a global level. And I suppose drawing the connections between poverty locally and globally, and looking at the things that underpin them, whilst accepting, as you've said a couple of times, Caroline, quite correctly, that a lot of amazing work is being done by international development NGOs and development educators here in Ireland, North and South. We still need, I think, to persuade colleagues to take these issues more seriously. What are the main challenges to doing that, Michelle, and how do we persuade people to come on board and start bringing this issue of neoliberalism and the wider economic discourse into our discourse as colleagues?
Well, I think Caroline alluded to some of the main challenges there, that a lot of development organizations, you're funded for a particular purpose, and that purpose doesn't necessarily encompass advocacy or, engaging in, I suppose, development strategies at a local level, nationally, at home. And if those organizations are sort of wholly reliant on state funding, then it can be challenging to be critical. And often, organizations generally, they're understaffed and overworked. In the community and voluntary sector, whether it's the global or the local, you're generally understaffed and overworked. So to actually have the time and the capacity to take a step back, as Caroline said, and think critically, but I actually think that is the vital thing, because the one thing that development organizations do have is that they're real innovators. because they are some of the few organizations who have the flexibility to develop and adapt policy, because they're implementing it in a country where perhaps there isn't the same, I suppose, top-down direction of policy that we tend to find in the more developed sector, where the policy is certainly developed nationally by government, and it's up to you to implement it. Where they're innovators, and they look at how you look at the global goals at the level in which they work in developing countries, but also, I suppose, connect that at a global policy level. I think that's why the critical thinking and critical analysis is vitally important. And if that means standing up and saying, you know what, our economic model is essentially broken, and at this point in time, all it is going to do, if we continue to follow this model, is drive up our emissions, cause more extreme weather events, and they may not impact on us here for 10, 20 years, but they're impacting on other people now. But that you have to stand up and say that, and actually show the impacts of policy. And another, I suppose I'll just make this point and finish on this, Stephen, is the issue of, it also comes down to the issue of resourcing and taxation, and how you collect tax at a national level and a global level. And ultimately what taxation is people making a contribution to ensuring the well-being of every person who lives in our society, in our state. We're all either net beneficiaries or net contributors at some point in our life cycle. But taxation is not some evil to be avoided. Taxation is the contribution we make, either as an individual or as a country, to the social contract. And then we get the benefits of that either as an educated workforce, or we can access a health service, we can go to school, to university, we can access childcare. So I think, I think development organizations certainly have a particular lens to bring to that discussion, and how the tax treaties between Ireland, for example, and developing countries either support economic development or if they impede local economic development, for example. And should those organizations, do they have a role in advocating for changes there, and advocating for changes in Pillar 1 now of the OECD process, and what that might mean for multinationals and where they book their profits, and can countries in the developing world actually get a share of those profits to fund their own infrastructure and services. Those I would see as the main challenges, but I certainly think the development sector has a really interesting lens and voice to bring to the conversation, and can help make those connections and inform policy both at a national and a global level. But it does take the capacity to be able to stand up and at times be critical of what policy is or isn't being implemented.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I think it is difficult at times to raise your head above the parapet, particularly when you're working in a large NGO with a lot of different departments, and you may find that you may think you don't have the voice or the influence to change policy, but perhaps we do. But what are your thoughts on that question, Caroline? How do we address the challenges of persuading colleagues to engage critically with all of these questions that we've raised here today?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. It really is, because as Michelle has touched on everything basically there, the elephant in the room is usually like donor limitations. So when you're funded by a state donor, you are limited in the extent of campaigning you can do, the extent of advocacy you could do. I guess the sector in itself, perhaps it is a time for that reflection and to think about ways, like for me, I would love to see like collective advocacy and campaigning across the sector. But again, some of the donors might not appreciate it. But so the challenge for NGOs is getting that level of independence so that they're less dependent on one main donor, like state donors. I mean, and again, that's back to a capacity issue. I mean, it's not easy. I don't have the answer. But I know it's time to ask the questions, and it's time as educators to come together and unpack those questions, even beginning like how can we get much more critical in our approach to development education.
Well, the Centre, excuse me, the Centre for Global Education and Financial Justice Ireland are going to be doing just that, because we've got a research grant from the Community Foundation to ask the question about why the sector hasn't really been addressing the dominant economic paradigm as part of our advocacy work and as part of our practice over the last 11, 12 years. So we'll see where that research leads, and it might provide a platform for a wider discourse within the sector between colleagues on how we start to come to terms with this issue and bring it into our discourse with each other. Listen, this has been a brilliant conversation. Fantastic. I'd like to thank you, Michelle, for joining us today and for your contribution. Caroline, brilliant to listen to you as well. And hopefully this conversation will lead to more debate between colleagues and finally some action. Thanks a million.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
So. It was